Welcome back. Joining me now is my political panel, Liberal MP Jason Falinski and New South Wales One Nation leader Mark Latham. Welcome to you both. Now let's start with this quite provocative piece, Jason, that you wrote in The Australian a few days ago, where you spoke about coal-fired power stations. You called any measures to, prolong their life protectionism, and basically said it was holding back investment in renewable energy.
Well, it wasn't meant to actually be a provocative piece.
Oh, you're accidentally provocative.
I was accidentally provocative.
Hate it when that happens.
So do I. But what it was simply saying was that we do know throughout history that when you protect certain sectors, that what you end up with is suboptimal outcomes for ordinary Australians and ordinary people, generally speaking. And coal-fired power doesn't need to be protected. It can be part of the energy mix and it can compete quite openly with other forms of energy, and it can do that very well. It has its role to play in the Australian energy market.
Mark, one of the points that Jason also made in his piece is that he said that renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy in the energy mix. Is this something that you agree with?
Well, no, I don't. Once you factor in the huge government subsidies, the backup energy that's needed because renewables don't run 24/7, so the huge costs of battery farms, pumped hydro, gas peaking plants, plus the transmission costs. The renewables Jason's talking about are in the Western Districts of New South Wales, so you've got to wire them up. And Albanese, in one of his very rare costings in the energy policy area, has costed this at $20 billion. $20 billion. So these are huge subsidies. And Jason's point about protectionism for the coal-fired power stations, what is he talking about? They're being run out of town. They're being run out of town in New South Wales by Liberal government legislation, which says no nuclear, no coal, no gas. We're picking winners. We're rewarding the rent seekers. We're going down the economically irrational path of saying there's only one sector that will survive into the future, and that's renewables.
Jason?
Well, that's just not true. I mean, it's absolutely untrue. We have one of the biggest gas fields being developed at the moment at Narrabri. It's one that the Liberal government in New South Wales and the federal government has been very keen to support and see developed. We are simply about making the rational decisions in terms of energy mix in Australia for Australians. If you start picking winners, which is what you would do if you start protecting coal-fired power stations from the market, then what you end up with is suboptimal outcomes, and that's what we want to avoid.
But what's the protectionism, Jason? You don't spell this out. It's argument by assertion. They're being run out of town. Matt Keane did the modelling for his policy and also the advice that said that his policy would drive the coal-fired power stations out of the market early. It would bring their closure forward. So where's the protectionism in this?
So Mark, the protectionism in this is quite simply that there are a number of people in Parliament, in both state and federal parliaments, who are arguing for taxpayer funds to be directly used to build a coal-fired power station if the private sector won't step up and do it. And that's just simply put subsidies and protection for a particular form of energy production in the Australian energy mix.
So your article was directed at Barnaby Joyce and Matt Canavan, but you didn't have the guts to name them. This is an internal government argument rather than a proven case of protectionism. Do you agree these coal-fired power stations are being run out of town? That these policies of Matt Keane will close them earlier than scheduled? Because that clearly is the consequence of picking winners and going 100% renewables.
Well, I don't think anyone's picking winners, Mark, and you keep making assertions of your own. The fact of the matter remains that what people like yourself are arguing for is direct subsidies for the building of coal-fired power stations. And the fact of the matter is that the private sector would prefer different forms of cheaper energy mix in the Australian marketplace, including New South Wales.
Well, Jason, let me tell you what happened in the New South Wales Parliament. I moved several amendments to write into the Keane bill, a bill that had Liberal, National, Labor, Greens supporting it because they're all gone 100% renewable, to write into the bill the principles of competitive and technological neutrality. And time after time after time, this was voted down. They didn't want it in the bill because they said no coal, no gas, no nuclear. It's only 100% renewable. Now, I'll send you the speeches. I sat up all night to make these points to 8 o'clock in the morning, an all-night sitting. There's no doubt that your Liberal factional colleague, Matt Keane, is the antithesis of the Bert Kelly approach that you wrote about. You said Bert Kelly would be rolling in his grave. Mate, reading your piece, he'd be laughing his head off because it just ain't true.
It's amazing, Mark, that you, a former Labor leader, is the one making these arguments towards a Liberal minister. I mean,
well, I think
it's a strange world.
I think we need an energy mix. For energy security and affordability, you need the mix. You need nuclear, coal, gas, renewables. Let them all rip and become a global energy superpower. That's where we should be. And it's not an argument about protectionism of the coal-fired power stations. It's the exact opposite.
Now, I want to move on to another topic. Joe Biden, he's started his presidency with an absolute blitz of executive orders. He's been criticised on this even by the New York Times, who say that these executive orders should not replace legislation. And there's concern that he's unable to get the legislation through. Jason, do you think this is appropriate course of action for him to implement his agenda, getting around the rule of law, in effect?
Well, it's just lazy. I mean, it's completely lazy. You have to do the hard work of legislating, and that means compromising, and sometimes it means not getting quite what you want. But what is happening in the United States is, at the moment, simply put, just lazy. And the Biden administration needs to get down to the hard work of actually making some real change, and that will mean actually doing deals. And, he talked throughout his election about bipartisanship, reaching out to the other side. We're not seeing very much of that at the moment.
Mark, what do you make of the start of the Biden presidency? Not just the executive orders, but also the fact that, the decision to impeach Trump seems to be continuing. There's reports unconfirmed that his legal team has abandoned him. And meanwhile, Biden has called a global summit on climate change.
Well, it's hard to believe that impeaching Trump is appropriate, given that the purpose of impeachment is to remove someone from office. Now, whether Trump was cheated or not, the voters, as the American system decided, put Trump out. You don't need an impeachment to kick a bloke who's already left. So, it just makes no sense. It's part of the divisive, spiteful approach. And Biden's not doing anything to stop that. Biden's just watching it happen. So all his talk about bringing the country together is complete BS. In terms of the other decisions, I mean, the telltale story here on climate change is what the climate envoy John Kerry said. Now, John Kerry is a multimillionaire Democrat. His family flies around in a private jet. He's got a personal carbon footprint the size of Mount Druitt. And he's got the hide to say he wants the workers, hundreds of thousands of them in the energy sector in the United States, to make better choices and go make solar panels. Well, I mean, the hide of these people, the disrespect to working people who just want to put food on the table and educate their kids. You talk about the elites. This Biden administration is elitism on steroids.
And it's why Trump had so many voters, even given the disastrous state that the US is in when it comes to COVID. Jason, I've got to get your reaction to the big news tonight that Kevin Andrews has lost pre-selection after a 30-plus year parliamentary career.
Look, it's sad. As I was saying to you before, when I first entered Parliament, Kevin Andrews was extraordinarily kind and collegiate, helped show me my way around Parliament House. So it will be sad to see him go. He's the longest serving member of the House of Representatives. He's still got at least a year before we bid him farewell, but he will be sadly missed. So it's a very sad outcome.
Yeah, my information on this from internal sources is that this wasn't a dirty tricks pre-selection. He was supported by the right faction in Victoria, by Michael Sukkar. The Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, supported him, but it was simply an its time factor and that, it was up for renewal. Speaking of politics, Mark, I've got to ask you about the Labor leadership. Chris Bowen this morning on Sky News didn't rule out a leadership bid in the future. I mean, that's almost too hilarious. Too hilarious for words.
Chris Bowen of franking credits fame.
Yes, exactly.
Negative gearing, drown the silent secrets, grocery watch, fuel watch. What does he think? You get the leadership by massive policy failures, one after another. Chris Bowen disgraced himself in the last campaign. The fact that he's even on the Labor front bench is farcical. I mean, Chris Bowen. Seriously? Someone ought to, put some truth and reality serum into that poor joker because he's losing it.
Mark, there are so many contenders to replace Anthony Albanese. It seems at the moment, obviously Albo did the reshuffle to try hold the ship together, but there are so many people coming out of the woodwork who seem to want the top job, whether it's Joel Fitzgibbon, Richard Marles, Tanya Plibersek, Jim Chalmers. What's your take on who would be the best leader for Labor and also whether Albo will make it to the next election?
Well, I don't think my old mate Joel is a contender, seriously. He might be a stalking horse for someone else, but, you know, the only one who really stands out, not on policy grounds, Labor's irreparable in that regard, is Tanya Plibersek, because she's got a bit of spark, bit of charisma. At a personal level, it's hard to dislike Tanya. Albanese, you know, he's got the personality of a wet sand shoe. So at least Tanya would give them a little bit of appeal, but unless they change some of these policies on energy, on job creation, stop sneering at working people, you know, back in good Australian values, then Labor's kaput.
Yeah, and you know, I missed someone out in the list of potential Labor leaders just then, Mark. I missed out Shorten. The intel is that Shorten would also like to have a go after the next election if Albo fails. So there you go. He hasn't given up hope.
Why not bring back Arthur Corwell or someone? You know, what about me? I could have another.
You could. I don't think you could. Mark Latham, Jason Falinski, thank you both very much for joining me.